You're sitting at a table laden with more food than anyone could possibly eat in one sitting. The air is rich with the scent of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes glazed with marshmallows, and pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. Around you, voices overlap in that particular symphony of family gathering. Laughter, old stories being retold, perhaps a gentle disagreement about politics quickly steered back to safer waters. Someone's uncle is explaining, for the third time, his theory about the proper way to carve a turkey. A child asks why we eat so much food on this particular Thursday in November. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you might wonder, where did all of this actually come from? Welcome to Midnight Deep Dive. Whether this is your first time joining us or you're a returning listener, I'm so glad you're here for this journey. Tonight, we're exploring Thanksgiving. Not just the holiday we know today with its parades and football games, but the entire tapestry of gratitude, harvest, and gathering that stretches back thousands of years and across countless cultures. We'll uncover the real story behind that famous 1621 meal, meet the people whose voices have been overlooked, and discover how a holiday born from complex circumstances became woven into the fabric of American life. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin where all good stories do, at the very beginning, when humans first looked at their harvest and felt something worth celebrating. Long before there was a Thanksgiving Day, before turkeys became synonymous with gratitude, before the Pilgrims ever set foot on Plymouth Rock, humans were gathering to give thanks. It's one of our oldest impulses, this need to acknowledge abundance, to mark the moment when the earth gives up its gifts, to say, somehow, we made it through another year. Imagine ancient Egypt, around 2000 BCE. The Nile has just completed its annual flooding, leaving behind rich, dark soil perfect for planting. Farmers gather at temples dedicated to Min, the god of fertility and harvest. They bring offerings of wheat and barley, the first fruits of their labor. There's music, drums and flutes, and dancing that goes on for days. The pharaoh himself participates, cutting the first sheaf of wheat in a ceremony that connects the divine right of kings to the practical matter of feeding a nation. These weren't just parties. They were acknowledgments of survival, celebrations that everyone had enough to eat for another season, gratitude expressed in the language of ritual and community. Travel west to ancient Greece, and you'll find similar celebrations, though the mood might be a bit different. The Thesmophoria was a festival held each autumn for 3 days, honoring Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone. But here's something interesting. This was a women-only festival. Men were completely excluded. Women would leave their homes, camp out together in temporary shelters, fast, make offerings, and share in rituals that connected them to the cycles of planting and harvest, death and rebirth. It was part harvest celebration, part mysterious rite, part women's retreat. The ancient Greeks understood something we sometimes forget. That gratitude for harvest is intimately connected to the feminine, to fertility, to the earth as mother. The Romans took the Greek traditions and, as Romans tended to do, made them bigger and more elaborate. Their harvest festival honored Ceres, goddess of grain and agriculture. We get our word cereal from her name, which tells you something about how central she was to Roman life. During Cerealia, held in October, there would be games, feasting, and offerings of the first fruits of the harvest. But the Romans added something else, a kind of social inversion. For a brief time during the festivities, social hierarchies relaxed. Masters might serve their slaves, the powerful might defer to the powerless. It was temporary, of course, but it acknowledged something important. That we all depend on the same earth, eat from the same harvest, share in the same fundamental human needs. Now let's cross the ocean, long before any Europeans arrived, to the Americas. The indigenous peoples of this continent had their own rich traditions of harvest celebration, though they varied tremendously from nation to nation, region to region. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, celebrated 6 major Thanksgiving ceremonies throughout the year. acknowledging different gifts from the natural world. There was a maple festival in late winter when the sap began to flow, a strawberry festival in late spring, a green corn festival when the first corn became ready to eat. These weren't just parties. They were sophisticated agricultural calendars expressed through ceremony, ways of staying in sync with the natural world. The Cherokee held the green corn ceremony, a time of renewal and forgiveness. Old fires would be extinguished and new ones lit. People would fast, cleanse themselves in rivers, settle disputes, and forgive debts. Then, when the new corn was ready, there would be feasting and dancing that could last for days. It was Thanksgiving, yes, but also New Year, forgiveness ceremony, and community renewal all rolled into one. What's striking about all these ancient harvest festivals, from Egypt to Greece to Rome to the indigenous Americas, is how they combined several elements we tend to separate today. They were religious and practical. They were solemn and joyful. They acknowledged both human effort and forces beyond human control. They brought communities together, but also connected people to something larger than themselves. The earth, the seasons, the mysterious forces that make things grow. There's something else worth noting. These celebrations weren't about abundance in the abstract. They were about specific, tangible things: this wheat, these grapes, this corn. The people celebrating had likely planted the seeds, tended the crops, and harvested with their own hands. The connection between work and reward, between planting and reaping, was immediate and obvious. When you give thanks for a harvest you personally grew, there's a different quality to that gratitude than when you're thankful for food that appeared, as if by magic, on a grocery store shelf. Anthropologists suggest that harvest festivals served crucial social functions. They marked time in agricultural societies where the seasons mattered more than any calendar. They redistributed resources. The wealthy were expected to provide lavish celebrations, ensuring that even the poor got to feast. They created shared cultural experiences that bonded communities together, and they provided psychological relief, a moment to relax after months of hard labor, to celebrate before the difficult winter ahead. But there was also genuine emotion in these celebrations. When you've watched clouds anxiously all summer, hoping for enough rain but not too much, when you've seen pests destroy a field or drought wither crops, when you've experienced the very real possibility of hunger. Well, when the harvest comes in full and abundant, the relief and joy are profound. These festivals gave people permission to express that relief, to acknowledge their good fortune, to say collectively, "We're going to be okay, we have enough." This is the deep current beneath Thanksgiving, the ancient river that flows through all harvest celebrations. Before we had pilgrims and turkeys and Macy's parade balloons, we had this: humans pausing to notice abundance, gathering with others to mark survival, taking a moment to feel grateful for the food that would carry them through another season. It's worth remembering this as we explore the specific American holiday that emerged from these universal impulses. Thanksgiving, as we know it today, is relatively new. Less than 400 years old as a concept, less than 200 as a national holiday. But the human need to gather and give thanks, that's as old as agriculture itself, maybe older. That's written into who we are as a species. Let's talk about the people who were already here, who had been here for thousands of years, who had their own sophisticated societies and harvest celebrations long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Because when we talk about the first Thanksgiving, we're really talking about a meeting between two groups of people. And for too long, we've only heard one side of the story. The Wampanoag people lived in the region that English settlers would later call New England. Their name means people of the first light, referring to their location in the eastern reaches of what's now the United States, where the sun rises first over the Atlantic. They weren't a single tribe, but a confederation of several groups united by language, culture, and political alliance. At their peak, before European diseases devastated their population, There were probably between 50,000 and 100,000 Wampanoag people living in villages throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Their world was carefully ordered and deeply connected to the natural cycles we talked about earlier. They had sophisticated agricultural practices, growing what they called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash, in a companion planting system that modern agronomists now recognize as brilliantly efficient. The corn stalks provided support for the climbing beans. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the other plants. The squash leaves spread across the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds. It was agriculture as ecosystem, and it had been refined over thousands of years. But they weren't just farmers. The Wampanoag were also skilled fishermen and hunters, following seasonal patterns of abundance. In spring and summer, they lived in villages near the coast, fishing for cod and bass, harvesting shellfish, and tending their gardens. In fall and winter, many groups moved inland, where hunting was better. Their homes, called wetis, were round structures framed with saplings and covered with bark or woven mats. They could be easily assembled and disassembled, perfect for their semi-nomadic lifestyle. They had complex social structures and governance. Leadership was hereditary, but not absolute. Leaders called sachems needed to maintain the support of their people. There were intricate diplomatic relationships between different Wampanoag groups and with neighboring nations. They had trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles. They had sophisticated spiritual beliefs, laws, traditions of storytelling, and oral history. They were, in other words, not the simple, primitive people that later American mythology would often portray them as. They had a civilization, complete and complex, and entirely their own. Then, in 1616, disaster struck. European fishing vessels had been visiting the coast for years, and with them came diseases for which the Wampanoag had no immunity. Smallpox, or perhaps leptospirosis, or maybe several diseases at once, swept through coastal villages. The epidemic was devastating. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the coastal Wampanoag population died within 3 years. Entire villages were wiped out. Social structures collapsed. The carefully balanced political relationships between groups were thrown into chaos. Imagine the trauma. Imagine watching almost everyone you know sicken and die. Imagine survivors wandering through empty villages, finding only bones and silence. Imagine the spiritual crisis this must have caused. What had they done to anger the spirits so severely? How could they appease whatever forces had brought this catastrophe? This was the world into which the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. They didn't find a pristine wilderness. They found the aftermath of an apocalypse. In fact, the Pilgrims settled in a village called Patuxet, which had been completely abandoned after the epidemic. The fields had already been cleared, the land already shaped by human hands. The English saw this as providence, God preparing a place for them. The Wampanoag survivors saw something very different: foreigners moving into the graves of their dead. So why did the Wampanoag help the Pilgrims? This question often puzzles people. After Europeans brought disease that killed most of their people, why would they teach these new arrivals how to survive? The answer is complicated and rooted in political calculation as much as kindness. The Wampanoag, weakened by disease and population loss, were vulnerable to their rivals, particularly the Narragansett people to the west. A leader named Ausamquin, known to the English as Massasoit, saw a potential alliance with the English as a way to strengthen the Wampanoag position against their enemies. If these strange foreigners could be convinced to become military allies, they might help balance the power dynamic that had shifted so dramatically after the epidemic. There was also a man named Tisquantum, known to the Pilgrims as Squanto, whose story is almost too strange to believe. He had been kidnapped by English explorers years earlier, taken to Spain, enslaved, escaped, made it to England, learned English, and eventually found passage back to his homeland, only to discover that everyone in his village, everyone he had ever known, had died in the epidemic. He was the last of his people. His story of survival and loss is profound, and his motivations for helping the Pilgrims were surely complex, mixing pragmatism, loneliness, and perhaps a desire to rebuild something from the ruins of his world. So in the spring of 1621, Tisquantum taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to catch eels, which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Without his knowledge, it's unlikely the Plymouth colony would have survived. The Pilgrims themselves acknowledged this in their writings. In the fall of 1621, after what seems to have been a reasonably successful harvest, the Pilgrims held a celebration. This is the event we now call the First Thanksgiving, though the Pilgrims themselves didn't call it that and had no intention of making it an annual tradition. According to the few written accounts we have, primarily from Edward Winslow, it lasted 3 days. The Pilgrims shot fowl, likely ducks and geese, possibly some turkey. They had venison. Here's where the Wampanoag part of the story gets interesting. According to Winslow's account, Massasoit showed up with about 90 men. They weren't invited, exactly. More likely, when the Wampanoag heard gunfire from the English settlement. The Pilgrims were shooting fowl, but the Wampanoag didn't know that. They arrived ready for potential trouble. When they realized it was a celebration, not an attack, they stayed. In fact, the Wampanoag contributed most of the food for this 3-day gathering, including 5 deer. Think about that for a moment. 90 Wampanoag men and about 50 English colonists gathering together. The Wampanoag outnumbered the English nearly 2 to 1. This wasn't the cozy, friendly dinner that appears in children's books. This was a political event, a diplomatic meeting between two groups who were still figuring out how to coexist, still establishing the terms of their alliance. What did they eat? Likely venison, waterfowl, fish, eels, shellfish, corn, and squash. Probably no potatoes. Those hadn't made it north from South America yet. Definitely no cranberry sauce or pumpkin pie. They had no sugar. The Wampanoag and English probably ate separately, prepared food separately, spent much of the 3 days in separate groups. There were language barriers, cultural barriers, deep differences in worldview and custom. But for 3 days in autumn 1621, they managed to share space, share food, and maintain a peace that was fragile but real. That peace wouldn't last. Within a generation, relationships between English settlers and the Wampanoag would deteriorate into war. The alliance that Massasoit had carefully constructed would collapse under the pressure of growing English settlement, land disputes, and cultural misunderstandings. In 1675, war broke out. King Philip's War, named after Massasoit's son Metacom, whom the English called King Philip. It was brutal and devastating. Thousands died on both sides. English settlements were destroyed. Wampanoag people were killed, sold into slavery, or forced to flee. The war effectively ended Wampanoag sovereignty in the region. For Native Americans today, Thanksgiving is complicated. Some celebrate it as a time for family and gratitude. Others observe it as a national day of mourning, gathering in Plymouth to remember the genocide and cultural destruction that followed that first shared meal. Many do both, celebrate with family while remaining aware of the painful history. The Wampanoag people still exist. They're not a vanished people from history books. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquina, are federally recognized tribes with tribal lands in Massachusetts. They've fought legal battles to maintain their sovereignty, their identity, and their connection to their ancestral lands. They continue their cultural practices, their language, their traditions. When we tell the Thanksgiving story, we need to include their voice, not as a footnote or a colorful addition to the Pilgrim tale, but as people with their own complex history, their own motivations, their own survival. The story of Thanksgiving begins with them, with their land, their knowledge, their decision to help, and ultimately, their resilience in the face of catastrophic loss. Now let's talk about the other half of that 1621 gathering. The English separatists we've come to call pilgrims, though they didn't use that term for themselves, because the story we tell about them is also full of myths, simplifications, and details that got lost or deliberately omitted over the centuries. First, who were they really? They were religious dissenters, members of a group that had separated from the Church of England because they believed it was too corrupt, too ceremonial, too much like the Catholic Church they'd left behind. This made them unpopular in England, where everyone was required to attend the Anglican Church. So in 1608, a group of them fled to the Netherlands, specifically to the city of Leiden, where there was religious tolerance. For about 12 years, they lived in Leiden. They were free to worship as they pleased, which was wonderful, but there were downsides. They were outsiders in a Dutch culture. They worked hard but struggled financially. Their children were growing up speaking Dutch, adopting Dutch customs, and the adults worried about losing their English identity. Plus, a 12-year truce between the Netherlands and Spain was about to expire, and there was fear of renewed war. So they made a radical decision. They would go to the New World, to the northern part of Virginia as it was then defined, where they could be English, practice their religion freely, and hopefully build a prosperous community. Here's the thing, though, not all of the separatist community made this choice. Many stayed in Leiden. Of those who decided to go, many couldn't afford passage. So the Mayflower carried only about 40 of the original separatist congregation. The rest of the 102 passengers were recruited in England: merchants, craftsmen, servants, and adventurers. The Pilgrims called these other passengers strangers, and there was tension between the two groups from the start. The voyage was supposed to take them to the mouth of the Hudson River, but navigational errors, storms, and perhaps deliberate action by the ship's crew brought them instead to Cape Cod, well north of their intended destination. They arrived in November 1620, with winter coming on and no time to sail farther south. They would have to stay where they were. Before leaving the ship, they drafted what we now call the Mayflower Compact, a document establishing self-government for their colony. It's often celebrated as an early example of American democracy, though it's worth noting that it was also a practical necessity. They were outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company that had sponsored them, which meant they had no legal authority to govern at all. The compact was a way to create order and prevent chaos. That first winter was brutal. Of the 102 passengers who arrived on the Mayflower, only 52 survived until spring. They died of scurvy, pneumonia, exposure, and malnutrition. At one point, there were only 7 people well enough to care for all the sick. They buried the dead at night, flattening the graves and planting grass over them so the Wampanoag wouldn't know how weak they'd become. Without the help we discussed earlier, Tisquantum teaching them to plant corn, the Wampanoag sharing knowledge and food, the alliance with Massasoit, the colony almost certainly would have failed entirely. Now here's something interesting. The Pilgrims didn't think of that 1621 harvest celebration as Thanksgiving in their religious sense. They had a tradition of Thanksgiving, yes, but for them it was a solemn religious observance, a day of prayer and fasting to give thanks to God for specific blessings. What happened in 1621 was more like a harvest festival or a secular celebration. It wasn't even mentioned in their records as particularly significant at the time. In fact, the Pilgrims only held about 3 documented days of Thanksgiving during their entire time as a distinct colony. These were religious observances, not harvest festivals. The two concepts didn't merge until much later. The Pilgrim story largely faded from American consciousness for a couple of centuries. The Puritans who came later, founding Massachusetts Bay Colony, were much more numerous and influential, and they overshadowed the Plymouth colony in historical memory. It wasn't until the 19th century that the Pilgrims were rediscovered and mythologized as the symbolic founders of America. This brings us to Sarah Josepha Hale, a woman who deserves far more recognition than she typically gets. Hale was a magazine editor, poet, and author. She wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, among other things. But her greatest achievement, in her own mind, was her campaign to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. Starting in 1827, Hale began advocating for a national day of Thanksgiving. She wrote editorials, published recipes, promoted the idea that Thanksgiving had been celebrated annually since that 1621 gathering, which wasn't actually true, but it made for a compelling narrative. She envisioned Thanksgiving as a unifying national celebration, something that could bring Americans together around shared values of gratitude, family, and faith. For 17 years, she wrote letters to governors and presidents, urging them to declare a national Thanksgiving. Some states did proclaim Thanksgiving days, but there was no coordination. Different states celebrated on different days, if they celebrated at all. Then came the Civil War. The country was literally tearing itself apart. President Abraham Lincoln was looking for ways to unite the fractured nation, to remind Americans of what they shared even as they fought against each other. In 1863, in the middle of the war, with the Union victory at Gettysburg still fresh, Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday in November as a national day of Thanksgiving. Lincoln's proclamation was remarkable. Written in the midst of the bloodiest war in American history, it managed to acknowledge both blessings and sorrows, to speak of gratitude even in the face of grief. It called Americans to commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, while also being thankful for fruitful fields and healthful skies. This was Thanksgiving as a tool of national healing, an attempt to create shared ritual even among people who were killing each other on battlefields. It's one of the more poignant uses of a holiday in American history. After the war, presidents continued to proclaim Thanksgiving annually. It became a tradition, though still not a legal holiday. That wouldn't happen until 1941, when Congress finally made it official, setting the date as the fourth Thursday in November. A change from Lincoln's last Thursday that Franklin Roosevelt had pushed through a few years earlier to extend the Christmas shopping season. Yes, really. The current date of Thanksgiving was chosen partially for commercial reasons. So when we talk about Thanksgiving as an American tradition, we're really talking about a holiday that was consciously constructed in the 19th century, using a selective and somewhat mythologized version of a 17th century event, promoted by a determined magazine editor, and formalized by a president trying to hold a country together during civil war. It's not an unbroken tradition stretching back to 1621. It's a tradition that was built, deliberately, with specific purposes in mind. The Pilgrims themselves, if they could see what Thanksgiving has become, probably wouldn't recognize it. They'd be puzzled by the football games, bewildered by the turkey-centric meal, possibly horrified by the commercialization and secular nature of the holiday. But they might appreciate the impulse behind it, people gathering with gratitude, marking survival, acknowledging blessings. Those are impulses they'd understand, even if the specific form would seem strange. What matters is that we understand the real story. The complexity, the human struggles, the political calculations, the slow transformation of a 3-day harvest celebration into a national holiday. It's a richer story than the myth, full of real people making difficult choices, surviving against odds, and building something that would outlast them, even if not in the way they intended. There's something revealing about how people celebrate in difficult times. How they hold on to rituals even when everything else is falling apart. How they find reasons for gratitude when circumstances suggest despair might be more appropriate. Thanksgiving, throughout American history, has been observed during some of the darkest periods. And those observations tell us something important about human resilience and the power of tradition. Let's start with that first official Thanksgiving in 1863. Lincoln's proclamation wasn't made during peacetime. It was issued in the midst of the Civil War, after the Battle of Gettysburg had claimed over 50,000 casualties over 3 days in July. When Americans sat down to Thanksgiving dinner that November, the war was far from over. The Wilderness Campaign, with its horrific casualties, was still months away. The conflict would continue for another year and a half. Imagine being a family in 1863, sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner with an empty chair at the table. A son or husband or brother who was fighting somewhere or already dead. Imagine being a widow with young children, trying to find things to be grateful for. Imagine being one of the 4 million enslaved people in the South, for whom freedom was still a promise, not yet a reality, despite the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet people tried to celebrate. Soldiers in camps on both sides of the conflict attempted to mark the day. Union soldiers had it somewhat easier, supply lines were better, and efforts were made to provide special rations for Thanksgiving. There are accounts of soldiers receiving turkey or chicken, potatoes, and even pie delivered to camps when possible. Confederate soldiers, especially in the later years of the war when the South's economy was collapsing, had much less. Some received extra rations of cornmeal or salt pork. Some simply noted the day and went back to the same hardtack and coffee they ate every other day. Letters from soldiers reveal a bittersweet tone. They write about missing home, about wondering what their families are eating, about hoping they'll survive to see another Thanksgiving. But they also write about making the best of things, about finding moments of camaraderie, about small reasons for gratitude. A letter from home, a warm day, surviving another battle. The Civil War Thanksgiving established something important. The holiday became associated with national identity during a time when the nation itself was in question. It was a way of asserting we are still a country, we still have shared values, we can still come together around something. That function, Thanksgiving as a marker of national unity, would be called upon again and again in future crises. Jump forward to the Great Depression. Black Thursday, the stock market crash that triggered the Depression, happened in October 1929, just weeks before Thanksgiving. By November 1930, when the Second Depression-era Thanksgiving rolled around, millions of Americans were unemployed. Banks were failing. Families were losing their homes. The crisis would continue through the entire 1930s. How do you celebrate abundance when there isn't enough? How do you gather for a feast when people are going hungry? Some families simply couldn't celebrate. They didn't have money for turkey or all the traditional trimmings. But communities found ways to adapt. Churches and charitable organizations organized community dinners. Missions and soup kitchens served Thanksgiving meals. There was a particular poignancy to these communal celebrations. People who had lost everything sitting together, trying to find something to be grateful for, maintaining the ritual even when the substance was diminished. Recipes from the Depression era show creative adaptation. Cookbooks suggested less expensive alternatives. Chicken instead of turkey, mock apple pie made with crackers when apples were too expensive, desserts using less sugar or substituting corn syrup. Women's magazines ran articles on how to make Thanksgiving dinner for $4, for $3, for $2. The ritual mattered enough that people found ways to observe it, even in stripped-down form. There's also something darker about Depression-era Thanksgiving. The knowledge that some people were celebrating with plenty while others were starving. The inequality that the Depression laid bare made the idea of a national day of gratitude somewhat complicated. Grateful for what exactly when you'd lost your job, your savings, your home? Yet the holiday persisted, perhaps because people needed it. Needed a day to pause, to be with family, to assert that things would get better. Then came World War II. By Thanksgiving 1942, America had been at war for a year. Young men were overseas in Europe and the Pacific. Families were dealing with rationing. Sugar, butter, meat, all the things that made a traditional Thanksgiving feast. Women who'd never worked outside the home were now in factories. the world had turned upside down. The government promoted Thanksgiving as a patriotic act. Propaganda posters showed families gathered around tables with slogans like, "Give thanks we're free," or "Ours to honor, theirs to defend," showing soldiers fighting overseas. Thanksgiving became entangled with wartime messaging about sacrifice and duty. Rationing made traditional celebrations difficult. Turkey was hard to get. Much of the nation's poultry production went to feed troops. Families made do with chicken, duck, or even rabbit. Sugar rationing meant pies were less sweet or made with honey or corn syrup. Butter was precious. Women's magazines suggested meatless Thanksgiving options, though the government did try to make some items more available specifically for Thanksgiving. For soldiers overseas, the military made enormous efforts to provide Thanksgiving dinner, understanding its importance for morale. There are photographs of soldiers eating Thanksgiving dinner on aircraft carriers, in mess halls in England, in jungle camps in the Pacific. The meals weren't home cooking, but they tried. Turkey, stuffing, gravy, sometimes even pumpkin pie, all prepared by army cooks doing their best with field equipment. Letters home from soldiers during this period often mention Thanksgiving. They describe the meal they ate, comment on how it compared to home cooking, talk about missing their families. Some tried to be upbeat. Others couldn't hide their homesickness and fear. Thanksgiving, for them, became a sharp reminder of everything they'd left behind and weren't sure they'd return to. Fast forward to more recent crises. After September 11, 2001, that first Thanksgiving was different. The country was processing trauma, fear, and loss. Many families had empty chairs. People who died in the attacks or soldiers already deployed to Afghanistan. The holiday took on new meaning, emphasizing what we still had, what we were fighting to protect. The 2008 financial crisis brought its own shadow to Thanksgiving. Once again, families were losing homes, jobs were disappearing, retirement savings were evaporating. The themes of the Depression-era Thanksgiving returned. How to celebrate abundance in times of scarcity. How to be grateful when the future looked uncertain. And then 2020, Thanksgiving during a pandemic. For the first time in memory, the government actively discouraged the central element of Thanksgiving, gathering with family. The CDC issued guidelines recommending people not travel, not have large family dinners, celebrate only with members of their immediate household. It violated everything Thanksgiving was supposed to be about. Some people followed the guidelines, having Zoom Thanksgivings, waving at grandparents through windows, leaving food on doorsteps. Others defied recommendations, insisting on gathering anyway, leading to heated debates about individual freedom versus collective responsibility. It was a Thanksgiving that reflected all the divisions and fears of that strange year. Yet people found ways to mark the day. They cooked elaborate meals for just 2 people. They organized neighborhood food deliveries. They found creative ways to maintain connection across distance. The holiday once again proved adaptable. What all these crisis Thanksgivings reveal is something important about human nature and about ritual. We hold on to celebrations even when, maybe especially when, circumstances suggest we shouldn't bother. The ritual itself becomes a form of resistance against despair, a way of asserting normalcy, an anchor in turbulent times. Thanksgiving in crisis becomes less about abundance and more about resilience. Less about what we have and more about what we're determined to preserve. The holiday shifts from celebration to defiance. We will gather, we will give thanks. We will maintain this tradition even when everything else is falling apart. There's something deeply human in that stubbornness. It's not always logical. Sometimes it causes problems. Gathering during a pandemic, for instance, wasn't the wisest choice. But it speaks to our need for ritual, for connection, for moments that anchor us to who we are and what matters. Every family that has celebrated Thanksgiving during hard times has added to the holiday's meaning. They've proven that it's not really about the food or the abundance. It's about the gathering itself, about pausing to acknowledge what remains even after loss, about the determination to maintain connection no matter what. That's a different story than the one about pilgrims and plenty. It's messier and more complicated, and in many ways, more true to what Thanksgiving has actually been for millions of Americans through the centuries. A light in dark times, a stubborn assertion that we're still here, still together, still finding reasons to be grateful. Let's talk about the bird at the center of it all, the turkey, that strange, somewhat ungainly creature that has somehow become synonymous with Thanksgiving. How did this particular bird end up as the star of America's favorite feast? And what's the truth behind all those turkey tales we've heard over the years? First, some turkey basics. There are two species, the wild turkey, native to North America, and the ocellated turkey, found in Central America. The wild turkey is what we're concerned with, and it's actually a pretty impressive bird. Adult males, called toms or gobblers, can weigh up to 25 pounds and have a wingspan of nearly 5 feet. They can run up to 25 miles per hour, and despite their bulk, can fly at speeds up to 55 miles per hour for short distances. The iridescent feathers that catch the light, the elaborate mating displays, the distinctive gobble. Wild turkeys are genuinely interesting creatures. They're also genuinely American. While many of the foods we associate with American cuisine came from elsewhere, wheat from the Middle East, pigs from Europe, cattle from various parts of the Old World, turkeys are New World natives. They'd been domesticated by indigenous peoples in Mexico at least 2,000 years ago, maybe longer. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the 1500s, they found domesticated turkeys and brought them back to Europe, where they became popular. Ironically, the Pilgrims probably ate turkey at that first Thanksgiving, because they'd learned about turkey as food in Europe, even though the birds were originally American. But here's the weird part about turkey history. The bird's name is based on a total misunderstanding. When turkeys first arrived in Europe, people confused them with guinea fowl, which were imported through Turkey, the country. So they started calling them turkey fowl. The name stuck, even after people realized these were different birds from a different continent. To make it even more confusing, in Turkish, the word for turkey is Hindi, meaning from India, because Europeans initially thought the Americas were part of India. So the bird's name in English and Turkish both reflect geographical confusion. The turkey is a bird named after places it's never been from. Now let's address the Benjamin Franklin myth, because you've probably heard some version of this. That Franklin wanted the turkey to be America's national bird instead of the bald eagle. It's a good story, but it's not quite accurate. Here's what actually happened. In 1784, after the bald eagle had been chosen for the Great Seal of the United States, Franklin wrote a letter to his daughter Sarah. In this private correspondence, not a public declaration, he expressed some reservations about the eagle, noting that it's a bird of bad moral character, because eagles often steal fish from other birds rather than catching their own. Then, in what reads more like gentle humor than serious proposal, he wrote that the turkey is a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America, a bird of courage, and would not hesitate to attack a grenadier of the British Guards, who should presume to invade his farmyard with a red coat on. This was a private letter, probably at least partially tongue-in-cheek, written after the decision had already been made. Franklin never formally proposed the turkey as the national bird, but the story is too good not to repeat, and it's become part of turkey mythology. Franklin did appreciate turkeys, that much is true, but he didn't wage a campaign to make them our national symbol. So how did turkey become the centerpiece of Thanksgiving? The process was gradual. In colonial America, harvest celebrations might feature whatever meat was available. Venison, goose, duck, fish, pork. Turkey was one option among many. But turkey had some advantages. It was large enough to feed many people. It was native and thus symbolically American. and by the 19th century, it was becoming more affordable as farming techniques improved. When Sarah Josepha Hale was promoting Thanksgiving in her magazine, Godey's Lady's Book, she regularly included turkey in her Thanksgiving menus and recipes. She helped codify what a proper Thanksgiving dinner should include, and turkey was always on the list. As her vision of Thanksgiving spread, so did the association between the holiday and turkey. By the late 1800s, turkey was firmly established as the Thanksgiving centerpiece. Other meats might appear, ham, roast beef, chicken, but turkey was considered essential. The bird had become so associated with the holiday that farmers began timing their breeding to ensure turkeys would reach market weight by late November. The turkey industry, such as it was, boomed. In the early 20th century, most turkeys were still raised on small farms and sold locally. But as demand grew, production scaled up. Breeding programs created larger birds. The broad-breasted white turkey, which has so much breast meat that it can't reproduce naturally and must be artificially inseminated, became the commercial standard. These birds grow much faster and larger than their wild relatives. A modern commercial turkey can reach 40 pounds, nearly twice the size of a large wild tom. This transformation hasn't been great for the turkeys. Modern commercial birds have been bred so aggressively for breast meat that many have trouble walking. They grow so fast their bones can't support their weight. They're typically raised in crowded indoor facilities, processed at just a few months old. It's efficient, and it's made turkey affordable, but it's also raised ethical questions about animal welfare that we're still grappling with. Then there's the presidential turkey pardon, that peculiar modern tradition. You've probably seen it. The president symbolically pardons a turkey right before Thanksgiving, sparing it from becoming someone's dinner. It's portrayed as a light-hearted tradition, a bit of whimsy in an otherwise serious job. But where did this come from? The history is murky. The practice of giving turkeys to presidents goes back at least to the 1870s. By the mid-20th century, it was common for turkey industry representatives to present turkeys to the president before Thanksgiving as a publicity gesture. What happened to those turkeys? Most were eaten, presumably by the president's family or staff. The pardon language didn't appear until much later. Some sources credit President George H.W. Bush with the first formal pardon in 1989, though the word might have been used informally before that. Since then, it's become an annual tradition, complete with a press event, dad jokes from the president, and the pardoned turkeys being sent to a farm or petting zoo to live out their days. Here's the dark secret about pardoned turkeys, though they usually don't live very long even after being spared. Remember, these are commercial birds bred to grow extremely fast. Even with the best care, their bodies aren't designed for long-term survival. Their hearts and organs struggle to support their unnatural size. Most pardoned turkeys die within a year or two of their pardon, victims of the very breeding that made them suitable for presidential pardoning in the first place. It's a strange ritual when you think about it, symbolically sparing one turkey while millions of others are slaughtered for the holiday. It's either a charming gesture of mercy or a bit of national hypocrisy, depending on your perspective. Maybe it's both. Despite all the baggage, the factory farming, the ethical complications, the ridiculous name, turkey remains central to Thanksgiving. It's one of the few truly American holiday traditions, and there's something to be said for a tradition that's actually rooted in this continent rather than imported from elsewhere. On Thanksgiving Day, about 46 million turkeys are eaten in the United States. That's one turkey for every 7 people. It's an astonishing number, representing a massive industrial effort to produce, process, and distribute that much poultry in time for the holiday. But for most people sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner, those industrial realities are far away. What matters is the turkey on the table, the smell of roasting meat that's filled the house all day, the ritual of carving, the debate over white meat versus dark, the inevitable drowsiness after eating too much tryptophan-laden protein. The turkey has become a symbol of abundance, of tradition, of American identity, of the complicated relationship between idealized holiday imagery and the realities of modern food production. It's a lot of symbolism for one bird to carry, but somehow the turkey has managed it, maintaining its place at the center of the Thanksgiving table, even as almost everything else about the holiday has changed. If that 1621 gathering had a menu, it would be almost unrecognizable to someone sitting down to a modern Thanksgiving dinner. So how did we get from whatever the Pilgrims and Wampanoag ate to the highly specific, almost ritualized meal we know today? The evolution of the Thanksgiving feast tells the story of American food culture, immigration, regional differences, and the power of tradition to both preserve and change. Let's start with what they probably didn't eat in 1621 that you'll find on most modern Thanksgiving tables. No mashed potatoes. White potatoes hadn't made it to New England yet. No sweet potato casserole with marshmallows. Sweet potatoes were around but weren't part of English cuisine, and marshmallows as we know them weren't invented until the 19th century. No cranberry sauce in the modern sense. Cranberries grew wild and were likely used, but they would have been served tart, not sweetened, since sugar was extremely expensive. No pumpkin pie. They didn't have butter for pie crust or an oven to bake it in, though they might have cooked pumpkin other ways. No stuffing cooked inside the turkey. Bread was a precious commodity, not something you'd waste stuffing into a bird. What they probably did eat: venison, waterfowl like ducks and geese, wild turkey, fish, eels, shellfish, corn in various preparations, squash, beans, onions, nuts, and wild fruits. It was a feast, certainly, but it looked more like a medieval English harvest celebration, crossed with Native American foodways, than like anything we'd recognize as Thanksgiving dinner today. So when did the modern menu solidify? Gradually, over the 19th century, as Thanksgiving transformed from occasional regional observance to national holiday. Sarah Josepha Hale, that magazine editor we talked about earlier, played a huge role. She didn't just advocate for making Thanksgiving a national holiday. She essentially prescribed what should be served at Thanksgiving dinner. In her magazine, Godey's Lady's Book, she published Thanksgiving menus and recipes every year. Her ideal Thanksgiving dinner included roast turkey with oyster stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, mashed turnips, baked squash, boiled onions, celery, pickles, plum pudding, mince pie, and pumpkin pie. By repeatedly publishing variations on this menu, by presenting it as the traditional and proper way to celebrate Thanksgiving, she shaped what millions of Americans would come to see as essential Thanksgiving foods. The dishes she promoted were a mix of English traditions and American ingredients. Roast poultry with savory stuffing was English. Mince pie and plum pudding were English Christmas dishes transplanted to Thanksgiving. But cranberries, pumpkin, and turkey were distinctly American. The Thanksgiving menu became a culinary metaphor for America itself, old world traditions meeting new world ingredients. Regional variations emerged, though, because America is vast and diverse. In the South, Thanksgiving tables might feature cornbread stuffing instead of bread-based dressing, sweet potato pie alongside or instead of pumpkin pie, and ham or roast pork in addition to or instead of turkey. In the Midwest, casseroles became important. Green bean casserole, that dish made with cream of mushroom soup and fried onions, was invented in 1955 by a Campbell's Soup test kitchen and quickly became a Thanksgiving staple in many regions. Immigrant communities adapted Thanksgiving to incorporate their own culinary traditions. Italian-American families might serve lasagna alongside turkey. Chinese-American families might include stir-fried vegetables or other dishes from their heritage. Mexican-American families might prepare turkey with mole sauce or include tamales. Jewish families might make turkey kosher and adjust side dishes to avoid mixing milk and meat. Thanksgiving became a canvas onto which different American communities painted their own cultural identities. The mid-20th century saw the standardization and commercialization of Thanksgiving food. This was the era of convenience food, and the holiday was not immune. Canned cranberry sauce, still molded in the shape of the can and marked with ridges, became acceptable, even preferred by some. Frozen turkeys made it possible for anyone to serve turkey regardless of access to a farm or butcher. Instant mashed potatoes, canned green beans, pre-made pie crusts. All of these made Thanksgiving more accessible, but also more standardized. Stovetop stuffing, introduced in 1972, was marketed specifically for Thanksgiving and became wildly popular. The fact that you could make stuffing in a pot on the stove rather than actually stuffing a turkey was revolutionary for some home cooks. Today, more stovetop is sold in November than in all other months combined. The 1960s and 70s also saw the rise of what we might call retro Thanksgiving dishes. Things like Jell-O salads with suspended vegetables, sweet potato casserole with marshmallows on top, green bean casserole. These dishes seem dated now, but they represented modernity at the time. Ways of using new convenience products to create elaborate-looking dishes without elaborate cooking skills. More recently, there's been something of a Thanksgiving food revolution. As American food culture has become more interested in cooking from scratch, using fresh ingredients, and exploring different culinary traditions, Thanksgiving menus have evolved again. You'll find recipes for brine turkeys, fancy sides made with fresh green beans instead of canned, cranberry sauce made with fresh cranberries, and interesting flavor additions like ginger or orange, artisanal breads for stuffing. There's also been a rise in non-traditional Thanksgivings. Vegetarian and vegan Thanksgiving has become more common, with tofurkey or elaborate vegetable centerpieces replacing turkey. Some people do Friendsgiving with pizza or tacos instead of turkey and all the traditional sides. Younger generations seem less bound by the traditional menu, more willing to experiment or just serve whatever they want. And yet the traditional menu persists. Despite all the variations, despite the regional differences and personal preferences, most Thanksgiving dinners still center around turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and pie. These items have become so associated with Thanksgiving that their absence feels noteworthy, almost transgressive. Why? Part of it is simple tradition. We eat these things because our parents ate them and their parents before them. Part of it is that these foods have become symbolically important, markers of authenticity, proof that we're celebrating correctly. And part of it is probably that these foods actually work well together. The rich turkey and gravy, the sweet and tart cranberry sauce, the starchy comfort of stuffing and potatoes, the sweetness of pie to finish. It's a well-balanced meal, at least in the sense that it offers multiple flavors and textures. There's also something psychologically important about eating the same foods year after year. It creates continuity, links us to past celebrations, provides a familiar anchor in an ever-changing world. When you eat your grandmother's stuffing recipe, you're connecting with her, with your family history, with all the Thanksgivings of your past. Food becomes memory, tradition becomes comfort. The dark side of the Thanksgiving feast is overindulgence. The average American consumes somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 calories on Thanksgiving Day, with some estimates going even higher. That's more than a day's worth of calories in one meal. We've turned a harvest celebration into an exercise in excess, competing to see who can make the most dishes, who can eat the most, who can produce the most elaborate spread. There's something almost compulsive about it. The table must groan under the weight of food. There must be leftovers, lots of them. If there isn't too much food, we somehow feel we've failed at Thanksgiving. This connects to American attitudes about abundance, about wealth being measured in excess, about more is better as a cultural value. It's not unique to Thanksgiving, but the holiday certainly exemplifies it. And then there's what happens after dinner, the food coma, that overwhelming sleepiness that hits after the meal. Everyone blames the turkey, specifically the tryptophan in turkey meat. But here's the thing. Turkey doesn't contain significantly more tryptophan than other meats. The real cause of post-Thanksgiving drowsiness is simpler. You ate way too much food, especially carbohydrates, which triggered a blood sugar spike followed by a crash. Your body is diverting blood to your digestive system to handle the massive amount of food you just consumed. You're not sleepy because of the turkey. You're sleepy because you ate 4,000 calories in 2 hours. But the tryptophan myth persists, maybe because it's nicer to blame the turkey than to admit we overate. It's one more piece of Thanksgiving mythology, one more way the holiday has accumulated stories and beliefs that may not be accurate but feel true enough to keep repeating. The Thanksgiving feast in all its forms is really about more than food. It's about hospitality, about showing care through feeding people, about creating a sense of abundance and security. It's about tradition and memory and family identity. And yes, it's also about eating too much, complaining that we ate too much, and then eating pie anyway because it would be wrong not to. The specific dishes may change, may vary by region and family and generation, but the impulse remains the same: to gather, to share food, to eat together. That impulse is as old as humanity. We've just dressed it up in very specific ways involving turkeys and cranberry sauce, and argued over whether stuffing should be cooked inside the bird or in a separate dish. The details change, but the meaning stays the same. Let's shift now from intimate family gatherings to one of the most public faces of Thanksgiving. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, that bizarre and wonderful spectacle of giant balloons, marching bands, and Broadway performances that has become as much a part of Thanksgiving as turkey and football. How did a department store parade become one of America's most watched events? And what does it tell us about how Thanksgiving evolved in the 20th century? The parade started in 1924, though it wasn't originally called the Thanksgiving Day Parade. It was the Macy's Christmas Parade, and its purpose was explicitly commercial: to kick off the Christmas shopping season and promote Macy's department store in New York City. The timing, on Thanksgiving morning, was strategic. Thanksgiving had become a national holiday, but wasn't yet the massive cultural event it would become. Christmas, on the other hand, was already a major commercial opportunity. By linking the two holidays, Thanksgiving morning leading into Christmas shopping, Macy's created something brilliant from a marketing perspective. That first parade in 1924 looked different from what we know today. It featured Macy's employees dressed in colorful costumes, floats depicting scenes from fairy tales and nursery rhymes, and animals borrowed from the Central Park Zoo, including elephants, camels, and donkeys. It was essentially a moving show, a free spectacle designed to attract crowds to the area around Macy's Herald Square store. About 250,000 people came to watch, which was considered a massive success. Macy's immediately decided to make it an annual event, but they had a problem with those zoo animals. They were unpredictable and sometimes frightened by the crowds. Macy's needed something else, something that would create visual impact without the logistical nightmare of corralling camels through Manhattan. Enter the giant balloons. In 1927, Macy's replaced the zoo animals with enormous helium-filled balloons in the shapes of characters like Felix the Cat and Toy Soldier. These were nothing like the sophisticated balloons of today. They were much smaller, and the handlers didn't quite know what they were doing yet, but they captured people's imagination. The balloons made the parade distinctive, gave it a signature element that would define it for decades to come. Here's something wild from the early balloon years. From 1928 to 1932, after the parade ended, they would release the balloons into the sky. They'd float away, eventually deflating and falling somewhere in the surrounding area. Macy's included a return address on each balloon and offered rewards to anyone who found one and brought it back. It was a marketing stunt, a way to extend the parade's reach beyond the parade route. Can you imagine giant Felix the Cat balloons floating randomly over New York and New Jersey, people chasing them across fields and neighborhoods? It sounds insane now, but apparently it was quite the thing until they stopped the practice after a few balloon-related incidents, including one that tangled with an airplane. The parade was suspended during World War II from 1942 to 1944. Helium and rubber were needed for the war effort, so there simply weren't resources for giant parade balloons. But the parade returned in 1945, and the post-war years saw it grow into a major national event. Television changed everything. The parade was first broadcast locally in 1939, but it wasn't until 1952 that it was broadcast nationally. Suddenly, people across the country could watch from their living rooms. The parade became part of the Thanksgiving morning ritual for millions of American families. You'd get up, maybe start cooking, turn on the TV, and watch the parade while preparing dinner. For many people, the parade became as essential to Thanksgiving as the meal itself. The balloons got bigger and more elaborate. Early balloons were relatively simple shapes, but as technology improved, Macy's could create more complex designs. Characters from popular culture became parade balloons. Snoopy, Kermit the Frog, Spider-Man, SpongeBob. These weren't just balloons. They were cultural icons floating down the streets of Manhattan, a three-dimensional catalog of what America was watching, reading, and thinking about. Creating these balloons is an astonishing technical feat. Modern Macy's balloons can be several stories tall and require dozens of handlers to manage them. The designers have to account for wind, for the narrow streets of Manhattan, for low-hanging traffic lights and wires. There are strict regulations about wind speed. If winds are too high, the balloons can't fly for safety reasons. Some years, balloons have been grounded or couldn't complete the route because of weather. There have been balloon disasters. In 1997, high winds caused the Cat in the Hat balloon to knock over a lamppost, which struck a spectator and caused serious injuries. It led to increased safety protocols, stricter wind policies, and lower flying heights for balloons. But the balloons continue because they're what makes the parade the parade. Without those giant floating characters, it would just be another procession with floats and marching bands. The parade route itself is iconic. Starting on the Upper West Side, making its way down to Herald Square and Macy's flagship store, where the parade officially ends with Santa Claus's arrival, signaling the official start of the Christmas season. That Santa appearance is non-negotiable. It happens every year, rain or shine, and it maintains the parade's original purpose of linking Thanksgiving to Christmas shopping. And speaking of Christmas shopping, let's talk about Black Friday, because it's impossible to discuss modern Thanksgiving without addressing the commercial juggernaut that has attached itself to the holiday. Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, has become the biggest shopping day of the year in the United States, with stores opening earlier and earlier, sometimes even on Thanksgiving evening itself. The term Black Friday has an interesting history. It wasn't originally a positive term. In the 1950s and 60s, police in Philadelphia used Black Friday to describe the chaos that erupted the day after Thanksgiving, when crowds of shoppers and tourists would flood the city ahead of the Army-Navy football game held on Saturday. It was a day of traffic jams, shoplifting, and general mayhem that police dreaded. Retailers didn't like the negative connotations, so in the 1980s, they began promoting an alternative explanation. That Black Friday was when retailers' account books went from red, loss, to black, profit for the year. Whether this was actually true or just convenient marketing is debatable, but the story stuck, and Black Friday was rebranded as a positive thing, a celebration of shopping and deals. By the 2000s, Black Friday had become a phenomenon unto itself, with people camping out overnight for deals, stores opening at midnight or even on Thanksgiving evening, and actual fights breaking out over discounted televisions. The phrase doorbuster took on new meaning when people were literally breaking down doors to get to sales. The whole thing is a bit grotesque when you think about it. We spend Thanksgiving Day professing gratitude for what we have, then immediately rush out to buy more stuff we probably don't need, sometimes trampling each other in the process. The contrast between Thanksgiving's message of gratitude and Black Friday's frenzy of acquisition is stark. In recent years, there's been some pushback. Some stores have started closing on Thanksgiving Day again, giving their employees time with their families. Online shopping, especially with Cyber Monday offering deals from the comfort of home, has reduced some of the in-store chaos. But Black Friday remains a major commercial event, one that casts a shadow over Thanksgiving itself. The connection between Thanksgiving and football is another piece of the modern holiday puzzle. Football on Thanksgiving began in 1876 with college games, became a tradition in many cities, and eventually moved to professional football. The Detroit Lions have hosted a game on Thanksgiving every year since 1934, with a break during World War II. The Dallas Cowboys joined them in 1966. Now there are typically 3 NFL games on Thanksgiving Day. And for many Americans, watching football is as much a part of the holiday as eating turkey. Why football? Partly timing. The NFL season is in full swing by late November. Partly American cultural association between football and autumn, harvest, masculinity, and gathering. Football provides something to do between dinner and dessert. A shared activity for families that might not have much else in common, background noise that takes pressure off of difficult conversations. All of these elements, the parade, the football games, Black Friday shopping, transformed Thanksgiving from a day of giving thanks into a full-blown American cultural event, a multimedia experience that begins with watching a parade on TV, continues with an elaborate meal, includes watching football, and now often ends with people leaving their families to go shopping. Is this what Lincoln envisioned when he proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday? Almost certainly not. Is it what the Pilgrims intended? Definitely not. But it's what Thanksgiving has become in modern America. A day that's part gratitude, part family gathering, part entertainment spectacle, and part commercial enterprise. You can lament the commercialization, the way a day meant for reflection has become tangled up with consumption. Or you can accept it as the way holidays evolve, as organic developments that reflect the culture that celebrates them. Modern America is commercial, entertainment-driven, sports-obsessed, and yes, also genuinely interested in family and gratitude. Thanksgiving, in its current form, encompasses all of that. It's messy and contradictory and probably impossible to neatly categorize. But it's authentically American, for better and worse. Thanksgiving, as we've been discussing it, is distinctly American. But the impulse to celebrate harvest, to give thanks, to gather and feast, that's universal. So what does Thanksgiving look like in other cultures? And how has American Thanksgiving been received or adapted around the world? Let's start with Canada, because Canadian Thanksgiving is the most similar to the American version, yet different enough to be interesting. Canadian Thanksgiving is celebrated on the second Monday in October, a full 6 weeks before the American holiday. The date makes sense. Canada is farther north, the harvest comes earlier, and celebrating in October means better odds of decent weather than waiting until late November. Canadian Thanksgiving has different origins than American Thanksgiving. While Canadians also have stories about early harvest celebrations involving European settlers and Indigenous peoples, their official Thanksgiving holiday developed independently. For years, Canada had various Thanksgiving observances, sometimes tied to royal events or military victories. It wasn't until 1957 that Parliament officially declared Thanksgiving would be observed on the second Monday in October. The Canadian celebration is generally lower key than the American version. There's no equivalent to the Macy's parade. The food is similar: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. But Canadians seem less rigid about the exact menu. The holiday is more about having a long weekend and gathering with family than about specific traditions that must be observed. Interestingly, because Canadian Thanksgiving is in October, it doesn't have the same connection to Christmas shopping that American Thanksgiving does. There's no Canadian equivalent to Black Friday immediately following Thanksgiving. That said, Canadian retailers have started promoting Black Friday sales in November, borrowed directly from American commercial culture, which means Canada now has Black Friday without the Thanksgiving immediately before it to justify the timing. Germany has Erntedankfest, which literally means Harvest Festival of Thanks. It's celebrated on the first Sunday in October and is primarily a religious observance, especially in rural areas. Churches are decorated with harvest goods: grains, fruits, vegetables, bread. There are church services giving thanks for the harvest, followed by community festivals with food, music, and dancing. It's less about a specific historical event and more about the general gratitude for successful harvest. The tradition includes making harvest crowns, large wreaths decorated with grain, fruits, and flowers. In some regions, there are processions through towns, harvest queens are crowned, and the festival extends for several days. But Erntedankfest isn't a major national holiday in Germany. It's more of a regional, rural tradition that's maintained by people with close connections to agriculture. In China, the Mid-Autumn Festival, while not exactly a harvest festival, serves some similar functions. It's celebrated on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month, usually in September or early October, when the moon is at its fullest and brightest. Families gather, share mooncakes, round pastries filled with sweet bean paste or lotus seed paste, and appreciate the full moon together. The holiday celebrates abundance, reunion, and gratitude for blessings. Japan has Labor Thanksgiving Day, or Kinro Kansha no Hai, on November 23rd. But here's the thing: despite the name, it's not really about Thanksgiving in the harvest sense. It's about honoring labor and production, celebrating workers and productivity. It evolved from an ancient harvest ritual, but has been transformed into something quite different, more like Labor Day than Thanksgiving. In Ghana and other West African countries, the Yam Festival celebrates the harvest of yams, a staple crop. Depending on the region, it's called Hamowo, Adwira, or other names. These celebrations can last for days or even weeks, and involve ritual offerings to deities and ancestors, feasting, drumming, dancing, and community bonding. The yam is sacred in many West African cultures, and celebrating its harvest is both a practical acknowledgement of food security and a spiritual observance. South India has Pongal, a 4-day harvest festival in January celebrating the sun god and the rice harvest. Homes are decorated, people wear new clothes, rice is cooked in new pots and allowed to boil over as a symbol of abundance and prosperity. Cows are decorated and honored for their role in agriculture. It's joyful, colorful, and deeply connected to both agricultural cycles and religious devotion. Many Jewish communities celebrate Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, in autumn. It commemorates the Israelites' time in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, but it's also a harvest festival. Families build temporary structures called sukkahs and eat meals in them during the week-long celebration. There are special rituals involving the lulav, palm frond, and etrog, citron, and the holiday includes both solemn remembrance and joyful celebration of harvest. So the impulse to celebrate harvest and give thanks is genuinely universal. But American Thanksgiving, as a specific holiday, hasn't really been exported the way some other American cultural products have. You can find McDonald's and Disney parks around the world, but you won't find many countries that have adopted Thanksgiving as Americans practice it. There are exceptions, sort of. American expatriates living abroad often celebrate Thanksgiving, either gathering with other Americans or introducing the holiday to local friends. Military bases around the world serve Thanksgiving dinner to troops stationed overseas. American companies with international offices sometimes acknowledge the holiday, giving American employees the day off or hosting Thanksgiving-themed events. Some countries have developed negative associations with American Thanksgiving, particularly those with similar colonial histories. The Thanksgiving narrative, settlers and indigenous people sharing a meal, can feel uncomfortable or even offensive in countries where settler colonialism led to genocide, displacement, and cultural destruction. The holiday can be seen as a celebration of colonization rather than a neutral harvest festival. Within the United States, there's been increasing discussion about how indigenous people view Thanksgiving. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is complicated at best, painful at worst. Some observe a national day of mourning on Thanksgiving, gathering in Plymouth to remember the indigenous people who suffered after European arrival. Others have reclaimed the day, using it to celebrate indigenous survival and resilience. Still others treat it as any other Thursday, rejecting the holiday entirely. For immigrants to the United States, Thanksgiving can be both welcoming and alienating. On one hand, it's portrayed as the quintessential American holiday, one that new Americans are encouraged to embrace as part of assimilation. On the other hand, it's full of specific traditions and cultural references that can feel foreign and impenetrable. Many immigrant families adapt Thanksgiving to incorporate their own culinary and cultural traditions, creating hybrid celebrations. A Chinese-American family might serve turkey alongside dumplings. A Mexican-American family might include tamales. An Indian-American family might prepare turkey with Indian spices or serve samosas alongside traditional sides. These adaptations make Thanksgiving their own, blend old culture with new, create something unique. There's something beautiful in that adaptation, in the way Thanksgiving becomes a canvas for different cultural expressions. It suggests that the holiday isn't as rigid as we sometimes think, that there's room for interpretation and personalization, that American doesn't have to mean abandoning everything else. At the same time, the pressure to celebrate Thanksgiving correctly, to prove one's Americanness by participating in specific ways, can be intense. For people who don't celebrate, who choose to ignore the holiday or actively reject it, there's often social pressure to explain why, to justify not participating in something that's portrayed as universal and wholesome. Thanksgiving's status as a secular holiday, theoretically not tied to any specific religion, makes it complicated in a different way. It's easier to opt out of religious holidays if you don't share that religion. But a holiday about gratitude and family. How do you explain not wanting to participate in that without seeming curmudgeonly or ungrateful? The global perspective on Thanksgiving reminds us that what feels universal and inevitable from inside a culture looks quite different from outside it. Harvest festivals are indeed universal, but the specific American version, with its pilgrim mythology, its turkey-centric meal, its parade and football games, its complicated history, is anything but universal. It's deeply American for all that implies: the good, the problematic, and the peculiar. Let's shift from the cultural and historical to something more personal and psychological. Why does Thanksgiving affect us the way it does? Why can it feel so comforting and so stressful at the same time? And what does the science of gratitude and human connection tell us about this holiday? Start with gratitude itself. Psychologists have studied gratitude extensively in recent decades, and the findings are remarkable. Practicing gratitude, actively acknowledging good things in your life, expressing thanks, focusing on what you have rather than what you lack, has measurable effects on mental and physical health. Studies show that people who regularly practice gratitude experience less depression and anxiety. They sleep better, They have stronger immune systems. They report higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction. They're more resilient in the face of stress. Grateful people tend to have better relationships, more social connections, and greater empathy for others. The mechanism seems to be both psychological and neurological. When we practice gratitude, we're training our brains to notice positive things, to focus on what's going right rather than fixating on problems. This doesn't mean ignoring real difficulties or adopting toxic positivity. It means balancing awareness of challenges with appreciation for blessings. Neurologically, expressing gratitude activates brain regions associated with dopamine and serotonin, the neurotransmitters linked to pleasure and well-being. It's similar to the brain activity you see during acts of kindness or when receiving rewards. Gratitude literally makes your brain feel good. So in theory, a holiday dedicated to gratitude should be psychologically beneficial, right? A day focused on appreciating what we have, expressing thanks, acknowledging blessings. That should be good for us. And it can be. Many people do find Thanksgiving emotionally satisfying. There's comfort in tradition, in gathering with loved ones, in pausing normal life to focus on gratitude. For people who genuinely enjoy their families, who have positive relationships and stable lives, Thanksgiving can be a highlight of the year. But for many others, Thanksgiving is complicated or actively stressful. Why? First, there's the gap between expectation and reality. Thanksgiving comes with enormous cultural baggage about how it should be. A warm, loving family gathering, everyone grateful and harmonious, a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. When your actual experience doesn't match that ideal, it can feel like failure. Maybe your family is dysfunctional. Maybe there are old grudges, political disagreements, painful histories. Forcing everyone together for a mandatory celebration doesn't magically resolve those tensions. Sometimes it makes them worse, concentrating all that difficult energy into one day. Maybe you're lonely. If you don't have family nearby, if you've lost people you used to celebrate with, if you're isolated for any reason, Thanksgiving can be a sharp reminder of what you lack. The cultural message that everyone gathers with loved ones on Thanksgiving makes being alone on the holiday feel worse than being alone on any regular Thursday. Maybe you're dealing with grief. If someone important died recently, their absence at the Thanksgiving table is profound. Holidays after loss are notoriously difficult because they highlight the gap where that person should be. Then there's the stress of preparation. Cooking a Thanksgiving meal is a major undertaking. Even if you love cooking, even if you're skilled at it, preparing that much food for that many people is exhausting. The pressure to make everything perfect, to recreate family recipes exactly, to satisfy everyone's preferences. It can transform what should be a joyful act of hospitality into an anxious ordeal. Family dynamics during holidays activate old patterns. Adults regress to childhood roles. Siblings fall into familiar conflicts. Parents offer unwanted advice. In-laws clash. Mix in alcohol, exhaustion from cooking, and the forced intimacy of extended time together, and you have a recipe for tension. There's also something psychologists call family systems theory, which looks at how families function as interconnected systems where each person's role affects everyone else. During normal life, these systems maintain some equilibrium, but holidays disrupt normal patterns. Extended family members who rarely see each other are suddenly in close quarters. The roles people play, peacemaker, rebel, golden child, scapegoat, become heightened. For people hosting Thanksgiving, there's tremendous pressure. Your home is being judged. Your cooking is being evaluated. You're responsible for everyone having a good time, which is impossible but doesn't stop people from trying. Hosts often end up so exhausted from preparing and serving that they can't enjoy the celebration themselves. For people traveling to someone else's home, there's different stress. You're a guest, which means you need to be grateful and pleasant even if things aren't to your liking. You're sleeping in unfamiliar beds, eating at different times than usual, surrendering control of your schedule. Let's talk about the politics at Thanksgiving phenomenon, which has become particularly acute in recent years. Families often encompass a range of political views. During normal times, people might avoid discussing politics to keep peace, but holidays force extended interaction, and with alcohol flowing and tensions high, political disagreements often surface. In increasingly polarized times, these disagreements aren't just about policy preferences. They feel like fundamental value conflicts, challenges to personal identity. How do you sit at a table with someone whose political views you find abhorrent? How do you maintain family bonds across deep ideological divides? Some families have developed rules: no politics at Thanksgiving. Some create activities or traditions that provide structure and limit unstructured conversation time. Some people choose to skip Thanksgiving with family entirely, celebrating with friends instead, or not celebrating at all. This brings us to Friendsgiving, a relatively recent phenomenon. The term Friendsgiving appeared in the mid-2000s, probably popularized by TV shows, and it describes Thanksgiving celebrations with friends rather than family. For many people, especially younger adults, Friendsgiving has become more important than traditional family Thanksgiving. Why? Because you choose your friends. There's less baggage, fewer obligations, more flexibility. Friendsgiving can be potluck, removing the burden from one person. It can be casual. Pizza instead of turkey, paper plates instead of formal china. It can incorporate different traditions or reject tradition entirely. And crucially, if it's unpleasant, you can leave without the guilt that comes with abandoning family. Friendsgiving reflects changing attitudes about what constitutes family. For many people, especially those who are estranged from biological family, whose families don't accept them, or who live far from relatives, friends become chosen family. Celebrating Thanksgiving with chosen family isn't abandoning tradition. It's adapting tradition to fit actual relationships. There's also growing recognition that the mythology of happy family gatherings causes real harm. The cultural insistence that Thanksgiving should be a joyful family time makes people feel defective if their families are dysfunctional, if they don't have family, if they find holidays painful rather than pleasant. Mental health professionals often see upticks in anxiety and depression around major holidays. The gap between expectation and reality, the stress of forced family time, the financial pressure, the emphasis on gratitude when you're struggling, all of it can worsen mental health challenges. But here's something important: the research on gratitude is real. The benefits of taking time to appreciate what we have, to acknowledge good things, to connect with others, those are genuine. The problem isn't gratitude itself. It's the specific form Thanksgiving has taken, the rigid expectations, the mandatory nature of it, the cultural insistence that there's one right way to celebrate. If we could separate gratitude as a practice from Thanksgiving as an institution, we might find something valuable. Regular gratitude practices, keeping a gratitude journal, expressing thanks to people who have helped you, noticing small positive things. These have benefits without the baggage of holiday expectations. Similarly, gathering with people you care about, sharing food, expressing appreciation. These are genuinely good things. It's the forcing of it, the obligation, the judgment about doing it right, that causes problems. The psychology of Thanksgiving reveals something fundamental about human needs and human struggles. We need connection, but we struggle with the specific people we're connected to. We need gratitude, but we resist forced gratitude. We need tradition, but we rebel against rigid tradition. We need belonging, but we want autonomy. Thanksgiving doesn't resolve these tensions. Instead, it concentrates them into one day, forces us to confront them, and then judge ourselves based on how well we handle something that's inherently complicated. Maybe the healthiest approach is to acknowledge all of it. the genuine value of gratitude and gathering, and the genuine difficulty of family and obligation. To celebrate if celebration feels right, to skip it if it doesn't, to adapt traditions rather than slavishly following them, to be honest about what we need rather than performing what we think we should do. The ultimate irony is that Thanksgiving, a holiday supposedly about gratitude, often makes people feel worse rather than better, but it doesn't have to. If we can release the mythology, accept the complexity, and focus on what actually nourishes us, whatever that looks like, maybe we can reclaim something valuable from the holiday. Or maybe we can let it go without guilt. Either seems healthier than forcing ourselves through a performance of gratitude we don't feel. So here we are in the 21st century, still celebrating a holiday that began as a harvest festival thousands of years ago, was reinvented as a national commemoration in the 19th century, and has been continuously transformed by commercialization, changing family structures, and shifting cultural values. What does Thanksgiving mean now, and where is it heading? For many Americans, Thanksgiving has evolved beyond its historical origins into something more personal and flexible. It's less about pilgrims and more about family, however you define family. Less about specific foods and more about gathering. Less about one particular gratitude and more about pausing to acknowledge blessings in general. This flexibility has allowed the holiday to survive and even thrive despite massive changes in American life. We're more mobile than previous generations, often living far from where we grew up. We're more diverse, with many Americans having no ancestral connection to the Pilgrim story. We're more secular, less connected to religious communities that might traditionally organize holiday celebrations. We're busier, more stressed, more fractured as a society. Yet Thanksgiving persists. Even people who question the holiday's origins, who are uncomfortable with its mythology, who critique its commercialization, many still participate in some form. Why? One reason might be that Thanksgiving has become one of the few times Americans give themselves permission to simply rest. It's one of the last holidays that hasn't been completely consumed by obligation. You're not expected to give gifts, send cards, decorate extensively, or perform elaborate rituals. You're just supposed to eat with people you care about and maybe acknowledge some gratitude. That's manageable in a way that other holidays aren't. There's also something powerful about synchronized celebration. When the entire country pauses on the same day, there's a sense of collective experience, of shared culture, that's increasingly rare. We don't all watch the same TV shows anymore. We don't all read the same newspapers. Our media consumption is fragmented into countless niches. But on Thanksgiving, we're all doing roughly the same thing at roughly the same time. That shared rhythm creates a sense of community, even with people we'll never meet. Thanksgiving is also one of the few truly American holidays. Independence Day is American, but it's specifically about nationhood and politics. Thanksgiving, despite its origins, has become more universal in its themes: gratitude, harvest, family, gathering. It's easier to claim Thanksgiving as your own, to make it meaningful regardless of your background, because the core ideas are so fundamental. The future of Thanksgiving will likely involve continued adaptation. We're already seeing this with Friendsgiving, with the rise of vegetarian and vegan Thanksgiving options, with less rigid adherence to specific menus and traditions. Younger generations seem more willing to question traditions, more comfortable mixing and matching elements from different cultural backgrounds, more interested in creating personal meaning rather than following prescribed forms. Climate change will affect Thanksgiving in practical ways. The foods we associate with the holiday, turkey, cranberries, pumpkins, all depend on specific agricultural conditions. As growing seasons shift, as water becomes scarcer, as extreme weather affects harvests, the availability and cost of traditional Thanksgiving foods may change. We might need to adapt our menus, find new traditions, accept different centerpieces for our celebrations. The reckoning with American history will continue to shape how we understand and teach the Thanksgiving story. There's growing recognition that the Pilgrim narrative, as traditionally told, is at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. Schools are starting to teach more complex versions of the story that include indigenous perspectives. Museums and historical sites are updating their presentations. This doesn't mean Thanksgiving will disappear or that we can't celebrate it. But it does mean being more honest about what we're commemorating, more thoughtful about the stories we tell, more aware of whose voices have been excluded from the traditional narrative. We can acknowledge the holiday's complicated origins, while still finding value in its contemporary practice. Some people advocate for transforming Thanksgiving entirely, moving away from any reference to pilgrims and indigenous people, and reimagining it purely as a secular harvest festival or day of gratitude. Others suggest adding explicit acknowledgement of indigenous people and their continuing presence to Thanksgiving observances. Still others propose abandoning the holiday altogether in favor of something new. The debate itself is healthy, a sign that we're thinking critically about our traditions rather than blindly repeating them. A holiday should evolve with the people who celebrate it. Traditions that become rigid and disconnected from contemporary meaning eventually die. Traditions that remain flexible, that allow for reinterpretation and personal adaptation, can continue for generations. One interesting development is the expansion of gratitude practices beyond just Thanksgiving Day. Many people now keep gratitude journals year-round, practice daily gratitude exercises, or incorporate Thanksgiving into their regular routines. In a way, this democratizes gratitude, making it less about one mandatory day and more about an ongoing practice. Thanksgiving, the holiday, might become less important as gratitude, the practice, becomes more embedded in daily life. The commercialization of Thanksgiving will likely continue to face pushback. Black Friday, once unstoppable, has seen some retreat in recent years as retailers recognize the backlash against Thanksgiving Day shopping. Some major chains have committed to staying closed on Thanksgiving, giving employees time with their families. Online shopping continues to replace some of the in-store frenzy. The cultural conversation about consumption, about what we really need, about the environmental cost of constant buying. All of this affects how Black Friday is perceived and practiced. There's also growing interest in alternative Thanksgiving traditions focused on giving back rather than just feasting. Many people volunteer at soup kitchens or food banks on Thanksgiving. Some organize community dinners for people who would otherwise be alone. Some use the holiday as an opportunity for activism or charity. This aligns with the gratitude theme, acknowledging blessings by helping others, expressing thanks through action rather than just words. For immigrant communities, Thanksgiving will continue to be a site of negotiation between old and new identities. Each wave of immigration brings new foods, new traditions, new interpretations to the American Thanksgiving table. This enriches the holiday, makes it more genuinely American by reflecting the actual diversity of America, rather than the mythical homogeneity of the Pilgrim story. The COVID-19 pandemic's impact on Thanksgiving in 2020 and 2021 might have lasting effects. Those years forced us to question what's truly essential about the holiday. When you can't gather in person, when you can't have the big family meal, when you have to find other ways to celebrate, what remains? For many people, the answer was connection, however they could achieve it. Virtual dinners, outdoor gatherings, socially distanced celebrations. People found ways to maintain the spirit of Thanksgiving, even when the form had to change drastically. That adaptability might serve us well going forward. If we can separate the essential meaning, gratitude, connection, pause, from the specific form, turkey, football, Black Friday, we have more flexibility to make the holiday relevant and meaningful regardless of circumstances. Looking ahead, Thanksgiving in 50 years might look quite different from Thanksgiving today. The meal might change as food production changes. The gathering might happen virtually as often as in person. The mythology might finally align more closely with historical truth. The commercialization might fade or might intensify in new forms we can't yet predict. But if the holiday survives, it will be because it continues to serve a fundamental human need. The need to pause, to acknowledge what we have, to connect with others, to mark the passage of seasons and time, to create meaning through ritual. That's what all those ancient harvest festivals were about. From Egyptian celebrations of the Nile's flooding to Wampanoag green corn ceremonies, to contemporary Thanksgiving dinners. The specific forms change, shaped by culture and history and circumstance. But the impulse remains, to gather, to feast, to give thanks. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need the holiday to be perfect or pure or simple. Maybe it's okay that it's complicated, that it carries difficult history, that it means different things to different people. Maybe the ongoing negotiation about what Thanksgiving means and how to celebrate it is itself part of the tradition. Each generation reimagining the holiday for themselves, adapting it to their needs, keeping what serves them and releasing what doesn't. Thanksgiving, in the end, is what we make of it. Not what history made it, not what commerce wants it to be, not what mythology claims it should be, but what we, collectively and individually, decide it means. That's the most American thing about it. The freedom to reinvent tradition, to question authority, to make something our own. Even, perhaps especially, a holiday supposedly about the past is really about the present and future, about who we are now and who we're becoming. We've traveled quite a distance tonight, from ancient harvest celebrations to giant balloon animals floating over Manhattan, from solemn moments of historical reckoning to the chaos of Black Friday shopping. If there's one thing this journey reveals, it's that Thanksgiving, like all living traditions, is messy, contradictory, beautiful, problematic, and deeply human. It carries the weight of difficult history alongside genuine warmth. It's been shaped by commerce and politics as much as by gratitude and harvest. It's simultaneously a celebration of abundance and a reminder of inequality, a day of family connection and family tension, a harvest festival that few of us have any direct connection to harvesting. Thank you for joining me on this journey through gratitude, gathering, and growth. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find moments of genuine gratitude amid the chaos. May you hold space for complexity while reaching for connection. And may you remember that the best traditions are the ones we adapt for ourselves, making them meaningful for who we are in this very moment.